Conversations across time. 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 Conversations across time.
Good evening, and welcome once again to Conversations Across Time. For those of you that were watching last week, you know that this is a special setting for us, and it's a special show that we're doing. I'm sitting here with the show historian, Mark Hoffman.
Good to be back.
Mark, last week we got into some conversations about Vladimir Putin and the new president of the United States. And yes, and I want to ask you a question, and I think it might be an illuminating discussion for our audience. And our audience is Conversations Across Time is a show about history and current events. And we know that our audience is up on current events and up on history. That's why you watch us. So we're talking to each other because I think we're all in shock in terms of world events and what's going on in the world. So we try to keep ourselves sane by talking to each other. And so we're happy to have you join us again. And I'm going to start off with talking about Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson is the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, and for those of from the UK. And for those of you who watch this show, you do know that Brexit and Great Britain's exit from the European alliance is something that was fostered and fought for by Boris Johnson. So how does Boris Johnson, as we talked about Trump, how does Boris Johnson figure into Vladimir Putin's plan?
Yeah, Boris Johnson is very similar to Trump and very similar to some of the European leaders that Putin supports. They're nationalist leaders. They have a lot in common. Number one, they want their country independent. Trump's saying, make America great again. Boris would say, make Great Britain great again. Putin says, make Russia great again. Le Pen in France would say, make France great again. So he would like, Putin will support anybody who, with this right-wing, strong, nationalistic movements. Now, by getting Britain out of the European Union, he's destroying the Union economically. By getting Trump to concede that the United States is no longer going to support NATO, he's destroying the military defense against any Russian movements. So he's killing two birds with one stone. But Putin will support any populist, nationalistic movement, no matter where it is in the world. He gave money to the French. He gave money to Boris.
Yes.
He gave money to, I forget his name, the guy that was in Italy. He's like Trump.
I was going to say.
Berlusconi.
Yes.
He gave money to him. So any nationalist that will support their countries now, because once you become nationalistic, my country jingoistic, then you're not going to join any unions. There's not going to be any alliance. It's every man for himself. Right. There's no and the European countries are not economically strong enough or military strong enough to stop anything Putin wants. So Putin, as I said before, he envisions a world where the United States and Russia divide up the world, almost right out of Orwell's 1984, where there were three, Oceania, and so I call it Eurasiana.
Yes, and the interesting thing about that is what that does essentially is by dividing the world and having two superpowers control everything, you get to control the populations. See, Trump comes from the background of money and moneyed interest. That's what he's about. Putin is about power. So that Putin is able to use Trump just like he's able to use Johnson. I mean, they further his interests, and it's not to help the people. They're trying to set us back to a time where this Grand Canyon that exists between the have and the have-nots gets even deeper. And we are now looking at this from a prism of you've got people in this country who elected Trump thinking that they elected a populist and someone that was going to help them.
They elected an oligarch, and Putin's an oligarch, and part of this whole strategy is to stop the people. Don't forget, there's vast number of workers in the world, in Russia, in Poland, and United States, who, if they ever got together, could topple any of these governments. It'll never happen because they control them, and the fact that Putin knows this, and he knows how to maintain a dictatorship in an oligarchy. And Trump's in his school. Trump might be in his knee like Putin is his mentor, because everything Putin did, I guess since '99, 2000 in Russia, is what Trump's going to try to do here. And I don't know, how tough the American people are going to be to stop him.
But see, here, and this is one of the reasons that we exist. This is one of the reasons Conversations Across Time exist, to expose, to just put a flashlight on these sort of activities. Because if you look back with this country as far back as to the 90s, really late 80s, when they started to destroy the labor. Labor has no voice. And so when you hear people who are so happy to disparage labor unions would have been the only thing that at least represented enough people to have a collective voice and an outcry against what's going on. So you destroy the labor unions. This plan, Donald Trump may be what's being used at this time, but the plan was in place a very long time ago when they were able to destroy labor unions in this country, labor unions in Europe. Labor just does not have the voice that it had. That was the only collective group of people that could have done something about what's going on now. And now that they've got an open road to do whatever they want to do.
I hate to keep making the, not on this show, but in other places, making the equivalency of Trump and Hitler. But there's a lot of, and the first thing Hitler did was destroy the labor unions. That was done.
Yes.
The next thing is freedom of speech. Trump's
he's attacking the press.
He's attacking the press. He wants to do away with Saturday Night Live, and the next thing is education, public education, where the schools.
His choice for Secretary of Education is a believer in vouchers.
The next thing Hitler did was put his political opponents in jail. We don't know what Trump's going to do vis-a-vis Hillary Clinton. And the last thing, he had his own private army, because the military, believe it or not, are more independent and would stand up to a dictator, especially if the dictator goes off half-cocked and makes mistakes. But when you have your private army, that's a counter to the military. And I'm afraid when he is going to start rounding up to 3,000 illegal immigrants, he's going to need some kind of police mechanism, and that's going to be
But you know something? Isn't there a police mechanism that's already in place now? We don't have to name the company, but I think there's a relationship between a private army in this country that got its foothold when we started putting off some of the tasks that the army used to perform for itself. We started letting that be done by a private company, which got to be huge. And that private company, by the way, has influenced President Trump's cabinet.
Right, but it's Blackwater, and the founder of Blackwater is the brother of Betsy DeVos, who's now the Secretary of Education.
Who believes in privatization of education.
And that would be, to me, the one thing that the people would have to rise up and get into the streets about. And if they don't, we're headed to a fascist dictatorship, is that if he calls on Blackwater, which is, as you said, Vivienne, already in place,
yes,
and he calls on them to round up I won't say the illegal immigrants. I like to call them undocumented.
Exactly, and I prefer that too.
Yeah,
but he calls them the illegals.
Right. I call them. If he transfers Blackwater to be the vehicle to round them up, because it's very easy after they do that to keep them in place, and then to get up to put people in jail or criticizing them.
Yes.
And there's I don't care what these Second Amendment people that supported Trump have guns. They're not going to fight Blackwater, or they're not. That's what we really have to look out for in terms of domestic policy and what Trump's going to do. And there's people around him that believe that a fascist dictatorship is in the interest of the money class, the oligarch. Hitler took care
I was
of
getting
all
ready
the
to say
industrial.
Hitler did that's right out of the Hitler playbook.
He took care of Messerschmitt, and he took care of IG Farben. He took care of all the industrial class. And the other thing we have to look out for, and we did a show. In fact, it was, I think, one of the Warm Water shows where you had Dulles on.
Who
And
represented?
we talked about Dulles's investments in Nazi Germany and how that, in the beginning,
clients.
influenced policy. So we got to look at all these investments and how it influenced policy.
And now for our regular viewers, you know who, when we say Dulles, we're talking about John Foster Dulles.
That's Vivienne's #1 like guy.
That's #1 guy for me to dislike. And John Foster Dulles ended up becoming Secretary of State. His brother Allen Dulles was the head of the CIA. So that when you were mentioning the companies in Nazi Germany, they were both attorneys, worked for a law firm by the name of Sullivan and Cromwell, and Sullivan and Cromwell represented so many Nazi industrialists. And guess what? They were very, very efficient in getting back, after the end of the Second World War, having the monies returned to all those Nazi industrialists who had participated in World War II. So, and this man became Secretary of State. So it's so out there that you would think it couldn't possibly, it'd have to be science fiction. But it's not science fiction. It's the truth of what is going on. So I cut across you, but I just wanted to make sure that the audience gets it. I know our regular viewers know.
There's too many similarities, and just foreign policy, domestic policy, just say that we're right. We're in for rough sledding, and we're in for a rough ride, both domestically and foreign policy-wise, because this man could create. What would happen, for example, if Putin is able to go through, which I think he will accomplish these goals, then you still have ISIS, you still have Assad, who's Putin's back, and you have Iran that has nuclear weapons.
Oh my goodness.
We also have Trump talking to Pakistan about some business deal there, and Pakistan is in conflict with India, and they both have nuclear weapons. So we were facing that in terms of foreign policy. I mean, like I think you alluded to it in the last show, is, growing up, we were hiding under desks in elementary school.
Yes.
I don't know what that was going to do. I mean, maybe I was crazy, but I would go back to class, and my teacher's name was Miss Patterson. I'd say, Miss Patterson, if they drop an atomic bomb on me, what's the desk going to have? And she'd say, shut up. Get in the back of the room and shut up.
Yeah. But this country was so up in arms about what could happen and at that point, there were only 2 entities that we knew of that had that technology. And now, as you just outlined, all of these countries have this nuclear capability. So where is that going to lead? I like to ask, or I like to say to people, human beings have not inhabited this planet. Compared to how long dinosaurs inhabited the planet, human beings have only inhabited this planet for a percentage of time that the dinosaurs inhabited the planet. Now, we don't know what happened to make dinosaurs no longer be available, but it does seem to me
climate change.
Yes.
And that's
another
thing.
There we go.
We have a president that doesn't believe in climate change. He even tweeted, it's a Chinese hoax.
Yes.
He even tweeted, it's a Chinese hoax. So we have that. So look at what we're looking at. We're looking at the possibility of, it's not that remote, of a nuclear war. Mm-hmm. We're looking at the destruction of the earth because nobody wants to do anything about carbon emissions in the air, and Trump doesn't believe it's man-made. And we're looking at the possibility of a semi or complete dictatorship. And it's not impossible. History goes in cycles. In 1921 or 1920, nobody envisioned Mussolini when he just started up. Yes. Nobody envisioned Hitler. Nobody envisioned Franco in Spain. So, you can look around the world now, and what Putin is doing, and Trump falls right into this, are these populist, nationalistic dictatorships. And that's what Hitler was. The Nazi parties, National German Socialistic Workers' Party.
Yes.
Right into the national.
And how did that fall into what was interesting when we did that show? And that was, I want to say we did that 2 years ago when we talked
More
about
than that, even more than that.
We talked about good Germans, and we had Countess Berthold on, and one of the things that she explained is that the aristocracy in Germany did not take Hitler seriously.
We can control him.
Yeah, we can control him. And how many people thought that about, Trump is never going to get the Republican nomination. And then when he got the nomination, he's never going to be president. And they thought that they could control Trump. And that's the same thing that happened with Hitler. And Hitler rose to power, and by the time that anyone knew anything, everybody was afraid, and they couldn't speak out against him. And that's sort of what's happening now. How many of your friends, Mark, and I know you and I have talked about this privately, how many of your friends
have shut up?
Have shut up. They were afraid.
They were anti-Trump on Facebook and on Twitter.
Yes.
And since he won, they shut up.
And have warned you to do likewise.
Yeah, and I was warned by a Trump supporter who's an attorney who said to me, you've been my friend for 50 years. Don't you know that they're watching you and you can get in serious trouble for criticizing Trump? And tell them what I should have said, which I didn't.
That when he said that to you, that actually makes your point. That's what we call a demurrer in the law. In other words, my opponent has already, the evidence that they have presented proves my point. I don't need to argue. I'll just sit down and shut up and let the court rule. And that's exactly what would have been a good thing to say to this man, because the mere fact that he was telling you that you had to be quiet, that you were being watched, makes the point.
Exactly.
Is the point.
And the other thing is, foreign policy, I hope we're wrong. I hope that he doesn't move toward a fascist state. I hope somebody in the administration whispers in his ear that he has to stand up to Putin. But I think it's our job as citizens and our audience's job to be watchful and to look out for these signposts of where we're going. Because if we're silent and we don't watch out, it'll happen before we can rise up and stop it. We can stop it if we're vigilant. And if we're wrong, what did we lose?
Yes. And it's interesting because on November 14th, we do know that President Trump and President Putin had a conversation. Now, what that conversation entailed, we don't know. But we do have the evidence of the things that we're talking about and all of the things that have happened since that conversation.
Right. And the next day, he bombed
exactly.
And killed civilians. Aleppo, and he killed civilians.
Yes.
And whether they talked about that or they talked about, how much they love each other, I don't know. But I'm sure in a tacit way, Trump said, go ahead, don't worry about it.
Because why would the very next day Putin feel so comfortable with attacking Syria and killing so many civilians, which is something that this country, we do know that we don't protest much, but we certainly would imagine there would have been an uprising in this country if indeed the United States had.
I think you said it in one of our discussions that, Trump would let Putin do all the dirty work in Syria, kill the civilians, and clean out the rebels, and then we could unite with
Assad.
Right, and Putin to defeat ISIS.
Yes.
And that's, Trump even said that in his campaigns. He don't know why we don't get along with the Russians to defeat ISIS.
To defeat ISIS.
Right, so that's a possibility. And, people say, well, we got to defeat ISIS. And, nobody wants terrorists, but at what cost?
Yes.
You defeat ISIS, now you control the middle. Now, what happens to Iran? And what's the relationship between Assad and the mullahs of Iran?
Yes.
And don't forget, Iran has nuclear weapons, and
Trump is very anti.
Trump has been ambivalent about the treaty
with Iran.
Right. And of course, the Russians are part of that treaty too, so we don't know what's going to happen now.
I'll tell you what I suspect. And we talk about people, for those regular viewers, that the John Foster Dulles and the Dulles brothers are people that I dislike. Well, there is one controlling force that I believe operates with all of these politics, and that is oil. You look at every conflict, and somehow behind it you can see their oil looms.
Well,
So,
no, you're probably right, and that's probably why you have people that's saying, we don't want clean energy, and you got all these people because
no climate change.
there's
it
no
doesn't
climate
exist.
change, because that isn't, the coal companies especially, but the oil companies and the gas companies.
Yes.
That's to their benefit. And, I hate to say this, and we did a show with Karl Marx, but Marx said, man, economic determinism, follow the money.
Follow the money.
If you see where the money is, then you see where policy is. It's not what's good for the country, it's good for what the oligarchs want and and they're gaining more and more control. And if people...
They're gaining the control with the complicity
you got that right.
of the United States government.
And that the people who should know better, and we talked about this on many shows, that why would these people support the people that don't have their interest at heart at all? We talked about the Civil War and the white Southerners. We talked about the
Social Security.
So it's the working class people. Why would these people believe Trump? And he promised, that we said in the last show, he promised to drain the swamp, and all he did was add to the swamp.
I think you said something that I found interesting, that now not only do we have a swamp, but we have a swamp monster.
Right. Goldman Sachs Zilla.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That's right out of a Japanese horror movie. You see this Goldman Sachs monster coming out of the swamp that Trump promised to drain. And listen, they're going to control the government. To be fair, Obama had people from Goldman Sachs in his administration
absolutely.
too. But Trump promised to get rid of all of them. So I'm not going to criticize Obama, and he criticized Hillary for taking money for making speeches, and he appointed more people to government posts from Goldman Sachs than Hillary would have ever been allowed. The Republicans would have filibustered, jumped over hoops, set fire to if Hillary were elected and she appointed Goldman Sachs people.
Yes. And what is interesting is the way that he did it was by flagging. He actually drew attention to Goldman Sachs.
Right.
Goldman Sachs used that as a weapon against Hillary. He turns around and appoints all the Goldman Sachs people. I mean, it's really brilliant strategy when you think about it, because what he accused Hillary of doing and using that as a weapon against her.
He did himself.
He did him, and he was always planning to do it. That was always the plan. Hillary got paid for some speeches, and whatever she got paid, whatever amount of money Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton have made from speaking before, those kind of moneyed interests is nothing in compared to what those interests are now going to be able to do in this country. The power that they wield and the amount of money that they're going to make, that it's a drop in the bucket. Her little speeches, and I'm not trying to demean her speeches, but I'm simply saying it's almost as though you wonder if Goldman Sachs wasn't helpful to Trump in giving him the arsenal that he used when he talked about money and Hillary's ties to the banking industry to assure that she was going to be defeated, because they knew that they could steal so much more with the Donald Trump.
Well, we know the election was, I would say, you have to give Putin a round of applause, because he won the election for Trump. They hacked the DNC, and WikiLeaks published it,
yes.
And that knocked Bernie out of the race.
Yes.
And they got rid of, and then we don't know. I mean, we know that there's secret intelligence that Russia hacked the election in the key states, and they haven't made it public, and it would probably disrupt the country. We probably have riots in the streets. But the very people that, like you said earlier, about hated the Soviet Union and hated Russia, are silent about a foreign government hacking our election and influencing our election. And
but hasn't that fallen from the press? There was coverage about the Russian involvement in our election, and it's sort of just gone away. Post-election, no one's even talking about it.
That's as scary as anything, because then there's no more democracy.
Right. Right.
And there's no way, unless there's a full investigation, we'll know the extent of the hacking We do know some took, but if they could hack the DNC,
Yes.
if they could hack the records of the DNC, they could hack an election. We know it's been done before. So
Yes.
what's the extent? And we know Putin wants to do that. He did it in other elections throughout the world. So how can we stand for that? Because now we're not a democracy, and that would be, if I were in power, that would be one of the first things that I would want to do, is to investigate that and ensure that our elections have integrity.
But you know, they set the stage for the hacking of the presidential election by lulling the country to sleep. There's no question who won the 2000 election. There's no question that it should have been President Gore. It's not. We know that. And I also.
We should do another show on that, because
Yes.
Hillary won by the biggest popular margin
Yes.
of any candidate that wasn't president.
That didn't become president.
Right.
And so we know that given that information, something else always happens. I listen, we're not here to preach revolution. We're just here.
Just be watchful. Just
to be vigilant.
observant. And Trump swears, and this boggles the mind, that the election was rigged. The popular vote was rigged against him, even though he won the election. I mean, that would be like winning a football game and saying the refs were against me.
Yes.
I mean, it's hard to believe. And his surrogate, Kellyanne Conway, goes on television and insists it was a landslide election. Now, he lost the popular vote by a big margin.
I think 2.5 million is the last.
In the Electoral College, his margin of victory is 44th out of 54 elections.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't a landslide there. It's right out of George Orwell's 1984. They call it Newspeak.
Yes.
Everything means the opposite. War is peace, bad is good. We won by a landslide. No, you didn't. You squeaked by, and it was probably stolen by Putin anyway.
Yes. And so I know that there has been a lot that we've discussed these past 2 weeks, and I also, as I said, am so pleased that we have the type of audience that we have, and that we know you understand these things. We just want to reiterate what's already in your minds, and I guess, as you alluded to, ever the school teacher, that it becomes our job to go out and talk to people who don't have the information, and to share that information with them, and to give it to them in doses that they can take. We know our audience can take it full strength, which is just what we did. This is espresso, but you got to water it down for these other folks.
We've got to tell our friends and relatives, whether they supported Trump or they support Hillary, to be vigilant. And that's the key. And that's because it can happen here.
It can happen, and history has shown what happens when you get someone, a group of people in power whose vested interests have not to do with what the population needs, but their business interests or their power drives. So I thank you for joining us. I know that you're hurting as a result of having to have conversations with family members and friends who just don't get it. We hope that we have helped to give you some tools in a way that you can express it to your friends, that they can accept it, because we already know you get it. That's why you watch this show. But we now want to give you some tools that allow you to get it to other people, to explain it to other people, because we know how you're hurting. So again, I thank you, Mark, for being here.
My pleasure, and all the shows we did are real important. This is really important.
This is really important, and go back and look at the website. Warm water. We talked about warm water. We talked about Germany. Just look at those shows and know that you've got a friend here. You're our audience, and we're your audience. So we rely on you getting the message to friends, and we hope that you've enjoyed this presentation, and we hope that you're as terrified as we are. And once again, this has been Conversations Across Time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next week.
Conversations across time. Conversations across time. Conversations across time, 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 conversations across time.